the way it got to the time of Joseph Smith, the world of folk magic he's in, is a really interesting story.
He was put on trial specifically for glass looking.
It's all about the desire for wealth, right?
Why aren't we willing to accept certain evidence that this was a part of Joseph Smith's life? Because it's uncomfortable.
God's going to be able to take that and move that in the direction he needs him to go.
Do we have other accounts, contemporary accounts of Joseph fulfilling that role as a seer?
Brigham Young refers to him as a natural seer.
Why aren't we willing to accept certain evidence that this was a part of Joseph Smith's life? Because it's uncomfortable.
Welcome back to Sword and Spirit. We're your hosts. I'm Tori. We have Daniel Sorensen, and we have the illustrious Dr. Christopher Blythe with us, the sole arbiter of my GPA.
That is right. It's good to be here with you guys.
Good to be here. So, just for those of us who don't know, who are you? And why would you be here?
Yeah, I'm a BYU professor, but I have a PhD in American religious history. I worked for the Joseph Smith Papers for a while in the Maxwell Institute, and then I got hired in, when I was a historian, people always said, Chris, you studied the weird. But then it turns out there's an actual field of people who study the weird sometimes, and they're called folklorists. And so I got hired as a folklorist at BYU, and I always knew I was a folklorist, but I didn't think there's jobs. My degree wasn't in folklore. And so, so I'm one of 3 folklorists that work at BYU.
There's only 3 of you?
Only 3 folklorists, yeah, and most colleges have 1 or none, so BYU is a pretty great place.
Yeah, and part of it is just because of the history we have with folklore and especially folk magic, as you call it, right?
Yeah, I think it's that. Also, in the 1960s, there was a great folklorist named Bert Wilson. William A. Wilson was the first Latter-day Saint that I know of to go on to get a PhD in folklore. And he went out and he wanted to study the Kalevala, this sort of Finnish, the Scandinavian epic, a myth, it has a lot in common with Norse. And when he got there to Indiana, the top university to study folklore, his advisor said, what are you doing? You got to dig into these Nephites, right? Dig into 3 Nephites. And anyways, Bert became a really famous folklorist, and he brought it back to BYU, and it became an institution here. And he also spent part of his career at Utah State, and so it became an institution there too. And so these 2 schools are some of the top folklore places in the United States right now, all because of this wonderful historical happening of Bert going on a mission, coming back wanting to study more about his people, and then having an advisor say, hey, actually there's something about your people that you should be digging into.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned Utah State, but we are not talking about secular Utah State. We're talking about religious BYU, and more specifically, how it kind of relates to church history. And I've seen a lot of people take these practices that the saints had, and it just destroys their testimony, especially here in the West, where these sort of like culture practices and whatnot, they kind of destroy people's faith because there's just like a sort of skepticism to it. Whereas in like Latin America, for example, where the people I served, they found it kind of boosted their testimony. So especially in the West, how do you find it strengthening instead of a detriment to your faith in God?
Yeah, we're talking about sort of spiritual practices outside of the official stuff we do in church.
Yeah, like the Seer stones or the divining rods, or just these sort of...
Well, I think this is true. There's a lot of sort of New Age practices or esoteric practices that could serve as an alternative to your religion rather than something that merges with it and strengthens you. I actually think that was God's plan when he took Joseph and said, I don't want you to be part of any of these churches. And then Joseph had to figure his way out, and what he found wasn't a bunch of people who don't think God speaks anymore. He found a bunch of people who actually thought there's an invisible world that we can interact with, and taught a lot of beliefs that would put him in the right mindset to meet with angels that would take over from there, right? And so for me, it's a very faith-uplifting idea that God uses the tools available to us at times, and in the great apostasy, people are going to have to find a way to remember that relationship they can have with God.
I like that. And could you give us just Because for people that don't exactly know what folk magic is, if you may hear stories, they may say, oh, it's just like Wiccans or something like that. I know my mission, they're Wiccans, and there might be a tendency to affiliate that with the same folk magic as far as dividing rods, seer stones. But a lot of people that really haven't studied a lot of LDS history may not know what that is. Could you just kind of explain a little bit what is folk magic, and how does it relate to Latter-day Saint history or just religious history?
Sometimes people use the term occult, and that's it makes it scary, right? Because we have this historical understanding, what is the occult, right? And so, but folk magic is vernacular or folk practices, so things you're not learning from an official institution that are designed to bring about results in the world. I mean, that's what magic is. When you think of Harry Potter, well, that's what we're talking about. That's magic. And when we're talking about these practices people have, they often think here, this is a sort of, if I perform these actions or use this tool, I can have these results. They're being taught in different communities, and they're different in each of these different cultures. Often when I'm teaching this in school, I emphasize the most important aspect of this, which is folk magic wasn't like non-Christian. For Joseph Smith or others, folk magic was a completely Christian system. They're probably not even thinking of it as one coherent idea, but practices that have come down from antiquity that they can use to be in contact, but in the case of Joseph, with God or with the Spirit. So the way it got to the time of Joseph Smith, the world of folk magic he's in, is a really interesting story. And it's tied up in the Protestant Reformation. So magic, systems of religion that aren't official, that exist alongside official religion, is universal. That's everywhere. But Protestants had a really interesting history of trying to weed out Catholic ideas within the faith. And a lot of that meant things like communication with saints, communication with angels, ritual, divination for sure, all sorts of ideas. And Catholicism itself tried to cut down on these practices as they colonized different areas. But it's really important this moment of the Reformation where we had people teaching against traditional Catholic practices. It's important that in New York there is no Catholicism going on, right? This isn't one of the churches he's praying about. But there's might be some truths and some interactions with the spiritual world that Catholicism had, and that maybe our Protestant brothers and sisters have withdrawn from. I think folk magic and its popularity passes down through a group of people we sometimes call the cunning folk. This just means everyday individuals who believe in these practices. Usually folk magic is for the things that lay individuals need, right? So if you want to get rich or figure out how to pay the bills, maybe there's a spell you could do. Maybe you could find treasure. If you want to figure out who you're going to marry, maybe there's a trick, a recipe you could do, a spell, and which might produce where that person is, or might even help you to see them, a sort of revelatory thing. Helps you find lost objects, all sorts of, and it heals people. These are the sorts of practices that folk magic is all about. Very rarely, it's not about salvation. That's a thing for churches, but it is about communication with the divine. So within England, Protestantism works really hard to weed out Catholicism. There's a great book, I'm not going to remember the author's name right this second, but it's called Religion and the Decline of Magic. And the central theme of this book is that the rise of this sort of folk magic practices, beliefs in ghosts, all the things that are prospering in Germany and England are part of this Reformation culture, sort of a resistant to the sort of Protestant norms of cessationism that's taking place there. I think it's so fascinating. So that comes over to the United States. It comes over, I think, if we spend a lot of time digging into this, German folk magic is really important, but also folk magic practices that are occurring right there in the United States that we see hints of if we were talking, well, at least the stories we tell about the Puritan culture of the time. D. Michael Quinn is the one who's famous for digging into this. And his advisor at Yale, John Butler, wrote a book called Awash in a Sea of Faith. And he took the story of these folk magic practices up to the time of Joseph Smith. And he talks about the folklorization of the occult. So he says some practices were like what we're talking about, completely on the ground already. But in Joseph Smith's days, things like astrology, things that would have been confined to a sort of elite group of people that were trained, has now lost the status it once had in society. And so if you're looking for the occult, the stuff that maybe you need to read lots of books to understand, or folk magic, the sort of spell stuff we're talking about, all of it is at a lay level, ready for the Smith family to have a role in their lives in the 1800s.
And just to clarify, was this contradictory to like the churches around them at the time, or was it completely normal?
No, I mean, churches wouldn't want people digging into treasure digging or so on. When Mormonism Unveiled is published in 1834, the first anti-Mormon book, the practices that Joseph participated in the 1820s, or that he's rumored to participate in, are the major theme to discredit him. And a lot of the people talking about him, I mean, they're presenting him as superstitious, or the Smith family is superstitious, as scam artists, people that don't believe this but are just pretending to, or as like deceived by evil spirits. All of that's occurring at this time. The run-of-the-mill churches, right, their purpose was to weed this stuff out, and they still wet it out. For Joseph Smith, the churches that he was going to at the time and exploring were very low churches.
Well, when you say low churches, what do you mean when you say that?
When you walk into, I grew up Anglican or Episcopalian, and so church for me was this elaborate, beautiful place with stained glass and a procession that starts off the service where the cross is walked in. My pastor is wearing beautiful robes and sometimes vestments, and there is a ritual performance and a certain script that the whole liturgy follows. The Book of Common Prayer serves as a sort of outline to everything. You stand and kneel and sit at different portions. You make the sign of the cross. Anglicans sometimes do the rosary. I mean, all those things are going on. Now, if you walked into a Methodist church, the church that Joseph was most interested in the 1800s, you wouldn't have seen any of that sort of ritual sophistication. Joseph's going to learn about all that ritual awesomeness through the other group that prospered because of Protestantism, which is Freemasonry.
So a lot of it could, come a little bit. There's like, those rituals that Joseph was influenced by. And correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't his 1826, it was 1826, it was either 1826 or 1828, but he was put on trial specifically for glass looking.
26, yeah.
And can you give us a little context there? So that has to do with with specifically folk magic, him, as it says, glass looking. If I understand correctly, in that case, he was acquitted, right? But can you give us a little bit of what's kind of the context there? How does it relate to folk magic, and why why was that a thing? Or not why was it a thing, but why do you think Joseph Smith was charged for defrauding people or glass looking if it wasn't unheard of or not even necessarily like uncommon at the time? We're trying to get rid of that.
I think it is fairly uncommon. I don't think this was a standard part of society. This would be like energy work in our day, maybe, right? I think energy workers are strange, but I certainly know a lot of them. But Joseph Smith Brigham Young refers to him as a natural seer, a guy who has this spiritual gift before he received any priesthood, and that meant that he could use this object, which in different sources usually is called a seer stone, but sometimes in sources is called a peep stone. And this is placed within a hat, and we know how the translation of the Book of Mormon occurs. But before that's occurring, Joseph is using a stone that provides, maybe if we were in Ancient Aliens, we'd use the term remote viewing, right? It helps him see spirits. It helps him see locations of things. And he's doing it for what D. Michael Quinn's professor called the supernatural economy of the 19th century, that there were individuals who professed to be able to look into a stone and be able to locate buried treasure. Where Joseph's living, there's lots of legends about, this is a folklore, so I love this, right? Lots of legends about Captain Kidd, and usually Captain Kidd is said to have deposited his treasure chest somewhere within this region, or maybe not, and has murdered one of his men to have the evil ghost, the angry ghost at least, watch over this treasure. And so you would have a treasure digger who's trying to figure out how to locate this cache of money. Joseph, the record we have at the 1826 trial, when the Joseph Smith Papers published it, they put it in an appendix saying we're not totally certain if this is a legitimate source or not. But I think the story is Joseph's accused of fraud, right? Of glass looking. And there's an implication there, just like if we said, I was able to show that the psychic had tried to defraud my grandma. It'd be the same sort of rationale. This is such a fascinating tradition. Joseph is, so far as we know, is not going to participate in further treasure searching in his career. There's one moment that perhaps he used this ability in Salem, Massachusetts in the 1830s, but I don't think that story is we don't know that it was supernatural means he was using at the time to seek treasure. But it's an ability he did have, and this is why the very first test that the angel Moroni gives Joseph is what? It's all about the desire for wealth, right? Like you can't take these plates until you don't seek to have them to gain wealth. And that's what Joseph was using his talent for before. And so the first thing the angel has to say is, look, man, if you're going to do this prophet thing, you can't be seeking.
You're going to be poor.
Maybe you're going to be poor, but you certainly can't be thinking about how to make yourself rich. Thing is, I think it's really easy to think there's something wrong about what Joseph did or what anyone's doing when they're looking for treasure.
Sure. Joseph says that the first thing that came into his mind when he saw the plates were, this could help my family, because his family was very much in poverty.
Yeah.
His brother Alvin worked on the farm. Alvin, from my understanding, could have let the farm and pursued what he wanted to, but he was determined to help his mother, who wasn't always necessarily in the best health, and help his father. So in that case, it's
there you go.
Reasonable. I would say it's even reasonable to
100%. And nowadays, maybe you're thinking, I'm going to go be a basketball player. I'm going to go be a musician. I'm going to be a podcast host. Whatever it is that you're dreaming on how to take care of your family. In this case, Joseph's dreaming on how to do something. I think he really had this gift. but God's going to be able to take that and move that in the direction he needs him to go.
So a common criticism that we'll hear oftentimes is, Joseph used a seer stone in the Book of Mormon. You can say that's a miracle. But other than that, anything with, treasure digging, him being a seer, that he wouldn't find anything. And for example, with Joseph Smith's treasure digging, it was said that he never once found anything for Josiah stole. Yeah. So talk to us a little bit about that specific criticism. How much weight does that have? And do we have other accounts, contemporary accounts of Joseph fulfilling that role as a seer?
One of the big things that makes me love Rough Stone Rolling, Richard Bushman's book, is I think it might be chapter 5. It's on the witnesses. And he talks about how we have sources in which the witnesses kind of test Joseph, right? What's the one?
Martin Harris, where Darkest Egypt, with that one? Or
yeah, is this they're hiding something in a haystack, right? And he's supposed to go out and locate it. And so Richard Bushman makes the point, is like, these aren't dupes. These are people that are like skeptical. What's going on here, Joseph? I mean, it would be great if Joseph Smith was like a 11 from Stranger Things, right? And that's roughly what we're talking about, right? This remote vision idea. And we could like test his abilities scientifically. Spiritualism later is going to happen in the 1840s after Joseph's death, and they're going to be really focused on the scientific side. Let's give these experiments. Witnesses are kind of doing that. But no, we don't have good evidence that Joseph was very gifted in finding buried treasure. He says he didn't have a lot of success. Do I think he actually had an ability? Yeah. I think for anything, I believe that I hold the Melchizedek priesthood, and I could give you a blessing, and if God wanted to heal you of your ailment, he could do it. But there's a petition to God to do it, and God has to take it over. I don't think there's examples of Joseph being effective in this role of seeking out wealth. For me, this is training ground for the real thing, where after he's going to be guided by an angel. He's going to say, look, you learned this up to this point. Now let's teach you the right way. And over here, this is the Urim and Thummim. And guess what? People have been doing something like what you've done for a really long time. Can you imagine that? Like, you're living in this world where you've had these sort of maybe rough friends even. First of all, God told you to stop going to church with the Protestants. And you meet these rough friends. Your family still believes in God. They're reading out of the Bible. They believe in, hopefully the salvation of all people. They're wrestling with different ideas. There's kind of a conflict about it. You find this rough group of friends who teach you spiritual practices. You get to keep your commandment with God. Don't join any of the churches. But you're also going to kind of have, it's fascinating, right? You're digging into this supernatural world. And I certainly was a kid like that. It led me to the church. And so, and then you eventually have this revelation from an angel, and the angel, just like before, how you were trying to find treasure and you didn't find it, the angel gives you a picture in your mind of where the gold plates are buried. And then he brings you there, and you actually think, it's it. It finally happened. I'm going to get the treasure. And the angel says, I don't think so, man. It's going to take you years. We got to work on this. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's very interesting too, because after that, it makes the other situations of Joseph Smith later in his life, why he, with the plates, he was so strict of who could see them. Where you had, the situation with Martin Harris, where he was, lost, or Joseph lost the ability to translate because of him and Martin's lack of due diligence, or where people said, just show me the plates. I said, I can't. It's not because I'm a liar or a fraud, but it's because I've been given a strict commandment, and I've learned from my past mistakes. Joseph talks about how that he was not really happy with his mistakes that he made, prior to prior to
Foibles of
translating.
youth.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
foibles of youth, and I think that's a great, a great example.
I think it is.
Yeah.
And he's not necessarily saying I was wrong to do folk magic. He's saying there were things in which I made mistakes, right? And so I think it's very reasonable to think that's associated, particularly since this was meant for publication, associated with the things he was accused of, which were treasure digging and so on.
Well, one question that I have, and is there, there's a movement in the church, for confidentiality, I won't say who, but where they perpetuate some of these ideas that Joseph wasn't involved in treasure digging, or Joseph didn't use a seer stone because for like the translation of the Book of Mormon. And we don't necessarily need to get into the translation of the Book of Mormon. That will be on another episode that we do. But specifically, like with that, why do certain Latter-day Saints take issue with that? I know, like specifically with the Book of Mormon, the argument that's used is, well, David Whitmer was not their he wasn't Joseph's scribe at the time. So how would he know this comes from years later, and it's not firsthand. So specifically with that, I guess there's two questions that I would love to get your thoughts on. Are first, why do we as Latter-day Saints take issue with that? Why do we feel like it's either threatening or it's just not comfortable? So that's the first question, and then the second is why aren't we willing to accept certain evidence that this was a part of Joseph Smith's life because it's uncomfortable?
First of all, we largely, and maybe in the early church this was there too, we've gotten nervous about divination, right? The idea of trying to seek revelation through means other than prayer and the sort of contact with Heavenly Father. Types of prayer, of course, we're okay with, but the idea that you might have an object that helps you along the way, it's something we became really uncomfortable with. Joseph didn't, right? Joseph had seer stones. He gave a rod to Heber C. Kimball. Who else did? Oliver Cowdery has a rod as well. And they're told they're not just divining rods like Tori and I have done in class, but they are rods that if they hold and pray, they're promised an answer. People see that like the crystal ball that a psychic might use, right? And so they see it as a competition to accepted religion. Joseph would also agree. He'd be nervous about the random person claiming this and wonder why you would trust them with what they claim to have. He dealt with Hiram Page, so right away we're told, don't buy into everybody that's saying this stuff. But all the way in the 1840s, he talks about how the seer stone is related to the passage in Revelation about those who go into the presence of God will be given a white stone with their name on it. And he tells the apostles, according to Wilford Woodruff, that every person has a Urim and Thummim, a stone that's supposed to be there. So he thought of it as a gift that could go on. But it made us really nervous because how we associate that way. And because anti-Mormons have used the idea of Joseph's practices in this regard as evidence that he was, if you look at the imagery, that he was satanic, right? In the 1980s, I joined the church in 1995, but the materials from the 80s were still the popular materials, the God Makers and the Tanners materials. They had a pamphlet called Magic, Reality, and the Occult or something. And on the front, it has all this satanic symbolism right next to the sort of more humdrum practices Joseph Smith was participating in. And I'm supposed to believe, that there's something not just superstitious about it, but evil and dark about it. That would make me uncomfortable. We're talking about a community in the modern church who's gotten nervous about this. Maybe because the Gospel Topics essay was sort of a whiplash effect, right? Where they grew up in a time where people didn't talk about translating the Book of Mormon through a hat, and so the image disturbed them when it was brought up again. It could be that sort of just new uncomfortableness to that narrative. I don't understand it because the Urim and Thummim and a seer stone are both rocks that provide divinatory powers, right? They're devices, just like the Liahona, just like anything else. And so I don't understand why I would be upset if someone like had a compass and God said, this compass is going to work for you, as if it was a Liahona, versus this other guy that has a Liahona. I'm not going to say only the Liahona is the real version, right? If both of them have results. And so I've never thought that was uncomfortable to think that Joseph Smith might have used the seer stone in translation, because for me it's really the same principle undergirding both of these. Your second question was?
Yeah, so my second question was why, and I think you kind of answered it, but just like why we as members, find it uncomfortable. And
I think we've allowed other people to determine what we're comfortable with. I think we often allow anti-Mormons and people very critical of the faith to determine what we should have an issue with. Urim and Thummim, seer stone, they're the same thing, guys.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to be disturbed by one and not the other. Heavenly Father has used objects to bless his children from the beginning of the time, from the coats of skin he gave to Adam and Eve, to the rod given to Aaron, to the staff given to Moses. I mean, this is on and on. The Liahona to Lehi. It's not a strange thing to think that God would use material things to help us in this life. And there's, of course, a debate undergirding this. Are these devices themselves inherently special, or is it our faith? I don't really have a strong opinion. I think most people want to say, well, they're governed by faith, and so let's not think of them as like supernatural devices. The Ark of the Covenant it falls off and it's going to blast you, right? So
there seems to be in a lot of different religions. I remember taking a World Religions class at BYU, Idaho, and one of the things that my professor talked about is in a lot of different religions you have an idol's probably not the best word, but for lack of a better term, like an idol that they kind of worship through.
A material representation, sure.
In Greek Orthodoxy, for example, you have certain, idols, icons that people will basically pray through to reach the divine. In, I believe, Buddhism, you have the Buddha statue.
Sure.
In Islam, you typically have the mosque that, especially there's one mosque where there's a lot of Muslims will gather around and worship at, and our common idea in our mind would be, whoa, that's culty, or that's just not, not
of course,
okay.
Islam would say, we certainly don't have idols. You can't even draw God or but they have the Kaaba, right? This place in Mecca where they are supposed to visit and go on the Hajj one time in their life. And there is a stone, a meteorite within this, with this shrine. And people worship the one true God via in the direction of this stone. And it's a meteor, meaning it wasn't created on Earth, right? So beautiful symbolism in that. And it's black. It's taken on sins of the people as they've come there. At least it's my understanding. I think Protestants got really nervous about imagery, and so we got nervous about saints. We got nervous of ritualistic practices. And so by the time you get to Joseph Smith's America, they've been reduced really low.
My question is, what advice would you give parents or teachers, especially those of youth who want to approach this topic but are struggling to do so in a way that isn't going to destroy these teenagers' faith?
I've seen a lot of religious educators pointing to technology as the comparison. Like if you're concerned about the idea that Joseph might have believed in divining rods and seer stones, people point to technology and say, well, seer stones like this phone. Maybe that works for some kids. I think we just need to say there's really not anything too weird about this. I mean, the narrative I told you, which is based on Richard Bushman, that God used spiritual practices preserved outside churches to instruct Joseph in not true religion, but truer religion than what was available in the churches, makes a lot of sense to me. It's a way of getting information down through the great apostasy. But also, I mean, we can just point to all these examples of, we don't like relics or anything, but you look at the Bible and it is full of conversations of physical objects that serve purposes. And we need to, really what I'd worry about with our kids is that we need to stop condemning other traditions that own their material objects. If we walked into a room and it was a sacrament service and they had stained glass, well, some of us would be weirded out by that if we'd never seen it. But we know that there's a couple buildings in Salt Lake we could go that have just that. A lot of times our cultural ideas, the way we're raised, affect what we think is acceptable. And we actually take our little cultural idea and we make it like, if it's not like this, it couldn't be from God. Well, God's not an American. He's beyond us, right?
Yeah, I love that. It reminds me of like the garment, or just the ordinances and covenants we make in the temple. Now, some people are like, that's weird, but a good way to think of it is like certain rituals that we do that can actually have beautiful truth in them. For example, when someone graduates college, high school, whatever, they wear a graduation gown. They do a little, you could say a ritual or for lack of a better term, a ritual where they bring, what was it called?
The tassel?
The tassel on from one side to the other, signifying that they are graduated. And that's not too different than what we do in the temple with, the robes of the holy priesthood. So it's like, I think a good way to kind of summarize it all is just because something's weird doesn't mean it's false. God works with us according to our cultural understandings.
Oh, Tori, this is one of my major points with my students. We need to be completely okay with the weird. If we when you go to the divine throne room, prophets are writing about this in Ezekiel and Isaiah, and when Christ sees...
It's not going to look like the White House.
That's right. It's not going to look like the White House. When Joseph sees Jesus, he borrows language from Revelation, from John, and how to express what this looks like and what it feels like. This is going to be weird. It's going to be a weird thing. The word mystery is used over and over again in Scripture. And let's embrace that weird. I have occasionally I hear people say, keep Mormonism weird. And I think that's fun. But we definitely never need to be nervous by something that feels strange to us before we've really investigated it.
With our last few minutes remaining, what is one thing you would like people at home to latch onto with everything that we've talked about?
I think at the end of the day, folk magic was actually part of Heavenly Father's plan of bringing about the restoration. I think Heavenly Father is, what do we say? He's playing 10D chess or whatever, He's playing at another level, and he's bringing down pieces of truth from the past. And that's going to take the form of some weird ways, probably. I love folk magic because it often shows, where do you learn it from? You learn it from like your grandma. You learn it from, your older brother. You're learning this really family training. I love that side of religion, period, as a folklorist. And it might explain, what Joseph's early spirituality was like. But the key for me is this is one way that Heavenly Father was able to get information down across the apostasy, make it so Joseph could actually get in contact with that angel who could bring him forward those other steps. It didn't have to be that way, but it's the way he chose.
I think that's something that's very special. God works with people according to their understanding. And that's one of the things that anyone that's been on a mission that had preached my gospel, that's one of the things that it says is God speaks to people according to their understanding. He spoke to the early reformers. He spoke to Muhammad, people all the way, people all the way back from a variety of different religions. That's why we have different belief systems, as God speaks them according to the understanding, and that's no different today. We don't believe the restoration is complete. We believe the restoration is ongoing. As President Nelson says, take your vitamin pills, buckle up. The coming days ahead are going to be exciting. Now they're also going to be, important. They're going to be important. They're going to be crucial to make sure you're grounded in the Savior. But we're going to see miraculous miracles. So, and I think that just ties in beautifully to what you said. But just kind of to wrap up, Chris, what if someone's interested in kind of like your work? Because I know me and Tori are familiar with you, with your Angels of Seer Stones podcast and your Skeptic podcast. Where can someone go to get a hold of you, or just to see your work, so that if they're interested in just understanding these things more?
Yeah. I wrote a book called Terrible Revolution that you can find. I also just last month had a 3 Nephites book come out, which is a lot of fun. But the place I'm most active on is Facebook as Christopher Blythe.
You're verified now.
I'm verified, and we have 2 million visitors a month. I'm actually passing it along to a social media crew, and so it's pretty fun. But that's actually the best way. Messenger is the best way to get in touch with me if you have a question. And you guys can include my email, or you guys visit Facebook and find it. I'm always willing to answer questions on fun topics among Latter-day Saints. But I love story, right? And so if you ever do want to look up my work, you're going to see I love story. And if you have a story, you should share it with me. So get in touch.
Thank you, Chris, once again for coming on. We'll put everything he mentioned in the description below, and we'll see you next week.